Today we've got the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Hey, good to be with you, Brian.
So first things first, obviously we've got a new COVID variant, Omicron. In the UK, they're seeing record cases already. That seems to be true in other places where Omicron has spread. So what do we know in terms of its transmissibility and its lethality?
Well, Brian, it's a good question because there are, in fact, three critical questions that we've been searching for answers for with Omicron. One is it more transmissible? Two, does it cause more severe disease? And three, is it shortchanged, if you will, in terms of protection against, through our vaccines and therapeutics? And here's what we found so far. We've certainly seen that there has been extraordinarily rapid spread in the UK, in South Africa, and other countries, which really do seem to indicate that this is in fact probably more transmissible. Although I should say that there's a component here also that may have to do with immune evasion. We know that many people who were previously infected with COVID-19 are getting sick in South Africa with this variant. We're seeing that in Europe as well. So how much of that rapid spread is due to intrinsic increases in transmissibility versus immune escape? Hard to say, but it's likely a combination of the two that are leading to significant spread. Severity, there's been some preliminary data from South Africa indicating that they're seeing lower hospitalization rates. So that's promising. We're keeping our fingers crossed that continues to be the case elsewhere. Keep in mind, though, that South Africa has a very high, what we call seroprevalence rate, which means that the number of people who have been either previously infected or vaccinated is very high, and it's primarily driven by the prior infection rates being very high in South Africa. And so the lower rates of hospitalization they're seeing, it's not 100% clear if that's because the virus itself is a lot less severe or if that's because people have at least some protection against severe illness from prior infection and vaccines. And finally, there's a question of, do our vaccines still work? And here there is some good news. We found that, if you get 2 doses of the mRNA vaccines, for example, that you will still have some decent protection against severe illness and hospitalization and death. There is a drop in terms of protection there, but it still holds at a fairly high level. Where there is a challenge is in your level of protection against mild to moderate illness, because that protection does drop. The good news is that if you get boosted, then you can actually really increase your protection against all kinds of infection, mild, moderate, and severe infection. Now we've seen that not just in the laboratory, but in real world, clinical studies. So that's why we're encouraging people get boosted as soon as you can. Certainly, if you're not vaccinated, it's more urgent than ever to get vaccinated, and double down also on the precautions that you're taking, particularly around masking in public indoor spaces.
Now, should we expect COVID to be endemic? And if so, what'll that look like? Will it be a flu shot situation every year, or will there just be a perpetual baseline of people on ventilators for the foreseeable future?
It's a good question, Brian. And so let's talk about what endemic means. Because sometimes when people hear the idea that we have to live with COVID, they think, oh my God, it's going to be as bad as it is right now and has been over the last years for the rest of our lives. And that's actually not what we're talking about. There are many viruses that we live with, and they either don't affect us, or affect very few of us in terms of severe disease, or we're able to blunt their transmission. So think, for example, about the common cold, right? We know that a lot of people get the cold, but very few people actually end up getting severely ill because of the common cold. And so what we've been looking at is recognizing that COVID will likely be around for years to come. How can we blunt the severity of its impact and reduce its transmission? And the good news is that we've actually been building tools to be able to do that. So vaccines help on both fronts. They both reduce severity and they also reduce the likelihood that you'll get sick and transmit it to others. There are therapeutics. Monoclonal antibodies are one example, but these oral medicines, which are now in the pipeline, if you will, and one of which from Pfizer, for example, has shown really promising results and is going through the FDA, authorization evaluation process. These are medications that can help reduce the severity once people actually do get ill. In the case of the Pfizer drug, their studies have shown an 89% reduction in hospitalization. So the bottom line is that with a combination of vaccines and oral and IV therapeutics and mitigation measures, this include using masks judiciously, using testing judiciously, we can actually find ways to live with COVID while significantly reducing the number of people we lose to COVID-19. And that's ultimately how we're going to get back to our way of life.
Now, we have large swaths of the population who are refusing to get that vaccine. To what extent does that facilitate the possibility of mutations that will then prolong the pandemic?
Brian, the more people who are not vaccinated, the more people who are likely to get infected. And the more people who are infected, the more chances the virus has to mutate and for harmful variants to develop. That's why it's so important that we vaccinate not just people in America, but people around the world.
Right.
And it's why the US has worked hard to make sure that we're donating doses to other countries and that we're pulling out the stops to make sure that folks in our country have every opportunity to get vaccinated. We've done that by making vaccines free, by making them available in many, many locations, by providing a lot of additional supports from free rides to free childcare to enabling people to actually take time off and get that vaccine. So it's critically important. But I also finally just want to remind people that we've made a lot of progress actually in vaccinating our country. So while there are still millions of people who are not yet vaccinated, around approximately 50 million folks who are not yet vaccinated as far as eligible adults, we actually have 200 million people in our country who are now fully vaccinated, millions more who have gotten one shot and now are on their way, hopefully, to getting that second shot. So that is good news we've made. And this has all happened actually in just a year. So we've got more ways to go. But I'm hopeful that people don't forget about the incredible progress we've made, because every one of those people fully vaccinated is a person whose chances of getting seriously ill are much, much lower.
You've been in public health for a long time, and a lot of the successes of public health efforts rely on a cooperative and well-informed population. We've defeated other crippling diseases in the past, like polio, because of that cooperation. But now that public health has effectively been politicized, how does it change our ability to be able to confront otherwise containable diseases? And will the US have lost its ability to defeat these diseases that we have defeated in the past?
Well, I'm very worried about this. I'm worried about the fact that in the last couple of years, we have seen two critical things which have undermined our COVID response. We've seen public health politicized, and it should never be politicized. It should be driven by science and by public interest. But we've also seen just the extraordinary spread of misinformation. And that has really compromised people's ability to make decisions for themselves and their families that are in their best interests. And I believe that everyone has a right to make their own decisions, but I also believe that everyone has a right to have accurate information to make those decisions with. So those two forces are creating a serious threat, not just to our COVID response, but to our response to future pandemics. And I do deeply worry about that. If we want to make sure as a country that we learn the lessons of COVID-19, we've got to, once again, empower public health leaders and scientists. We've got to support them. We've got to invest in public health. And we've got to get back to this idea that public health is in everyone's interests. It is something that should be the source of bipartisan support. We should be speaking with one voice about what science guides us to in terms of what's going to ultimately save people's lives and prevent them from infection.
To that point, a lot of the misinformation and disinformation that we're seeing right now is coming from only a few sources, a few outlets. But the problem is that because these media environments are generally closed loop ecosystems, feedback loops, really, how do you, A, reach those people who've been cut off from hearing accurate information? And B, how do you deal with those bad actors who are putting people's lives at risk?
It's an important question because you're right. In the current ecosystem in which people take in their information, it's not actually one ecosystem. There are multiple fractured ecosystems which don't always talk to each other, where up is down and down is up, depending on which ecosystem you're in. And each ecosystem in some ways has its own facts and set of facts. And that can be extraordinarily damaging because there's no sort of baseline truth that people can get together on and can rely on. So I think there are a few things that we've got to do. I think number one, we have to track down where this misinformation is coming from and understand how to hold platforms accountable, the technology platforms that are driving so much of the misinformation spread. Now, they may not be intentionally driving that, and I actually don't think that they are, but by allowing this misinformation to proliferate on their sites, they're subjecting people in the United States and around the world to extraordinary harm. And they're doing so with little accountability at this moment and really with very little transparency. That can't be allowed to continue because it's putting everyone's health at risk. I do think that part of what they have to do, the platforms, is take aggressive action against people who are intentionally spreading misinformation. And we call that disinformation, right? Misinformation that's willfully spread. And there are, a limited number of actors who are having an outsized impact, on people's health in an adverse way. But finally, I think the way to reach people in this ecosystem, which isn't, by the way, unfortunately going to change overnight, the way to reach people is actually through the people they trust. And that's why in a moment like this, we have millions of more people that we need to reach and get vaccinated. We've got millions who need to get boosted and get boosted quickly. It's important that we empower moms and dads, grandparents, the friends, around the country with the information that they can use to talk to their family and friends, because that's how you save a life right now. You talk to your family and friends, you make sure that they got vaccinated, and if they're vaccinated, that they got boosted. And especially with Omicron coming, potentially much more transmissible version of COVID-19, getting that shot is more important now than it ever has been. And your voice as a family member or friend, that could make the difference. And I don't just say that theoretically. I've seen this make a difference, Brian. I've talked to people. I just talked to a gentleman actually recently from Wisconsin who was skeptical about getting vaccinated. He and I had about a half hour or so conversation, worked through what his questions were. He ultimately made the decision to get vaccinated, but he didn't just stop there. He went back to his hometown and he spoke to many people there in his workplace and in his community. And now many of them have made the decision to get vaccinated because the information came from somebody they knew and trusted. That's the power of what one voice can do.
Now, is there anything positive from the pandemic that we can take after it's over, like QR code menus, for example?
Well, actually, this is the thing that really gives me hope, Brian, is I think the more I watch humanity go through crises, whether it's COVID-19, whether it was the Ebola or Zika crises that were when I was Surgeon General during the Obama administration, whether it was the Boston Marathon bombing, which happened when I lived in Boston years ago, whether it was 9/11, which took place when I was in graduate school. Like all of these struggles have been painful. But as humankind, we've learned from them and we've actually in many ways gotten better as a result. So with COVID-19, there are many innovations actually that people have developed that I think will hold. Take in healthcare, for example. Many people adopted telemedicine, the process of actually getting healthcare consultations virtually during the pandemic. Now, you can't do that for everything. You can't have virtual surgery, but you can have a virtual consultation with your mental health provider. You can have a consultation with your primary care provider for certain conditions or for follow-ups. And that's incredibly helpful. And I hope that will not only stay, but expand. But one of the many things I'll mention, one more, Brian, I think that's really important, is I think many people have come through this pandemic with a deeper appreciation for how important their relationships are with one another. Sometimes you have to have something taken away from you to realize how important it is. And during the pandemic, many people weren't able to see their family and friends and gather in the way they used to. Not just family and friends, but they weren't able to see coworkers. They weren't even able to bump into strangers in a coffee shop. And we realized how much of that human interaction really mattered to us and to our mental health. And so my hope is that coming out of this pandemic, that many people will do what I see a growing number of people starting to do already, which is to start making decisions in their life to design their life around relationships rather than designing it entirely around work or other considerations. Building a people-centered life could be one of the most important takeaways from this pandemic that we have.
I do want to dig into that a little bit, the issue of mental health. America's young people were already experiencing unprecedented mental health challenges before COVID, thanks to social media, because of school shootings and so on. But COVID really exacerbated those problems. And we're seeing a lot of that play out right now. How do we address that?
It's the critical question right now for exactly what you mentioned. Our kids are struggling right now during COVID, but they were not in a good place before COVID. And when I think about some of the numbers that concern me most, one of them is a statistic about high school students, about the fact that 1 in 3 high school students in 2019, before the pandemic, said that they felt persistent feelings of hopelessness and sadness. High school should be like an incredibly exciting time in your life when you're starting off and there are great opportunities opening for you. But a third of high school students are feeling persistent sadness. And the thing is, that was a 40% increase from over the prior decade. We've seen a significant increase in suicide rates in the 10 years preceding the pandemic. And then, of course, the pandemic has worsened anxiety and depression for many kids. So the reason I issued an advisory on youth mental health just recently was because there are steps we can take to address this crisis. In fact, we laid out concrete steps that 11 different sectors could take, from schools to tech companies, to individuals, to local government, to healthcare workers. And here are just a few of them. We know that investing in expanding access to treatment, especially treatment that's integrated with primary care, is so important. A lot of people can't get the care that they need. Second, we know that schools can invest in social emotional learning curricula, and we also need to support schools in getting more mental health counselors, in schools themselves, so they are available to help kids. We know that tech companies have a responsibility here as well to be transparent with the data on how tech platforms are actually impacting our children, particularly social media platforms. We know that some kids actually are benefited from their use of social media, but other kids are actually harmed and can feel more lonely, worse about themselves, more anxious, more depressed, after using social media. We need to understand who those children are who are at risk so we can best help them. And that's where we need the tech companies to step up. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, we all have a role that we can play in changing the culture around mental health and how we think about mental health. Because unfortunately, there's still a lot of stigma, as you know, Brian, around mental health concerns. And that stigma prevents people from admitting they're struggling and from seeking help. And so we can change how we think about and talk about mental health. We can do that by starting conversations with family members, by sharing our own story, which is often one of the most powerful ways to destigmatize mental illness. We do these things together, Brian, we can make a massive difference in the lives of kids all across America.
Before you go, I know that you lost a number of family members during this pandemic. I just wanted to check in and see how you and your family are doing.
Gosh, that's so kind of you to ask, Brian. I appreciate that. We lost 10 family members during the COVID-19 pandemic here in the United States and in India, where my parents grew up. And most of them, if not all of them, died before they had the opportunity to access a vaccine. And that's heartbreaking for us because, we now know, thankfully, there are vaccines available here in our country in abundance. More and more other countries are getting access to the vaccine. And we so wish that those relatives of ours who we lost had lived to see this day. And hopefully, if they had gotten vaccinated, their lives could have been saved. So it's been tough for us, but, we've tried to do what my parents taught me when I was a kid, which is that when you are suffering, that one of the best ways to get through that suffering is to not only give yourself some time, but also to reach out and serve others. Because sometimes in our service to others, we find our own salvation. And we have found that in applying ourselves to the work of addressing COVID-19, trying to get more people vaccinated, get them more accurate information so they can make good decisions for their families, that's helped us heal during these difficult times. And I really appreciate you asking.
As far as the rest of us go, everybody is grateful for the work that you're doing, and it's there's no doubt that it's saving a lot of other lives around the country and the world. So with that said, Dr. Murthy, thank you so much for taking the time and for the work that you've been doing thus far.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. And thank you for everything you're doing to help get accurate information out there. I'm sure you are saving lives as well. So grateful for you.